Steel True Blade Straight, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Arthur Ignatius Conan Doyle was born in Edinburgh on May 22, 1859. His mother, Mary Foley, was of Irish extraction. She could trace her ancestry back to the influential Percy family of Northumberland and from there to the Plantagenet line. Mary recounted tales of history, high adventure, and heroic deeds to the young author, which were to be the seeds of inspiration in his later writing career. The family was large. Arthur was the eldest of 10 children, and life was difficult for his mother, who struggled to bring up the family on the meager income provided by her unambitious husband, Charles Altamont Doyle, a civil servant and occasional artist. Charles was prone to bouts of epilepsy as well as depression and alcoholism, which eventually led to his being institutionalized in 1893. Education and influences. In order to help Arthur escape his depressing home background, Mrs. Doyle scraped enough money together to send him to Stonyhurst College, a strict Jesuit boarding school situated in an isolated part of Lancashire. It was at their establishment that he began to question his religious beliefs, and by the time he left school in 1875, he had firmly rejected Christianity. Instead, he began a lifelong search for some other belief to embrace, a search that eventually led him to spiritualism. It was also at Stonyhurst that he encountered a fellow pupil named Moriarty, a name that he would use to great effect later in his writings. Conan Doyle was always picking up trifles and tidbits of information, ideas, and concepts that he encountered and stored away with the idea of possibly using them in the future. After studying for a further year with the Jesuits in Feldkirch in Austria, Conan Doyle surprised his artistic family by choosing to study medicine at Edinburgh University. During his time at the university, 1786 to 1881, he encountered two professors who would later serve as models for his characters. In his autobiography, Memories and Adventures, published in 1924, he describes Professor Rutherford with his Assyrian beard, his prodigious voice, his enormous chest, and his singular manner, characteristics that Conan Doyle would later assign to the colorful Professor George Edward Challenger, the central character in his famous science fiction novel The Lost World, 1912. Even more significant was his association with Dr. Joseph Bell, whose method of deducing the history and circumstances of his patients appeared little short of magical. Here was the model and inspiration for Sherlock Holmes, and it is interesting to note that the first collection of Holmes short stories, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, 1892, is dedicated to my old teacher Joseph Bell. It has been said that Conan Doyle looked upon Bell as a father figure because he lacked one at home. To help pay his university tuition and assist his mother with the upkeep of the family, Conan Doyle undertook many part-time jobs, including that of medical assistant in Birmingham, Sheffield, and Shropshire. He even served as a ship's doctor on an Arctic whaler, another experience that provided material for his writing, particularly the ghost story The Captain of the Pole Star and The Adventure of Black Peter. From doctor to writer. After graduating in 1882, Conan Doyle became a partner in a medical practice in Plymouth, Devon, with Dr. George Turneville Budd, who had been a fellow student at Edinburgh University. Budd was an eccentric and volatile man, and the partnership soon disintegrated, leaving Conan Doyle to pack his bags and set up a practice on his own in Southsea, New Hampshire. Not New Hampshire, but Hampshire, England. By this time, he had already tried his hand at writing fiction and had several short stories published, but it was while in Southsea that he made a more determined effort to achieve success as an author. As he slowly built up his medical practice, Conan Doyle toyed with the idea of creating a detective story in which the protagonist, a character called Sherlock Holmes, solved a crime by deductive reasoning in the manner of Joseph Bell. In Memories and Adventures, he observed, reading some detective stories, I was struck by the fact that their results were obtained in nearly every case by chance. I thought I would try my hand at writing a story in which the hero would treat crime as Dr. Bell treated disease and where science would take the place of romance. This idea materialized in the form of the novel A Study in Scarlet, with Sherlock becoming Sherlock, and a legend was born. It was published in Beaton's Christmas Annual in 1887. Conan Doyle accepted the meager of €25 and in doing so relinquished all claims of the copyright. Following the publication of A Study in Scarlet, Conan Doyle turned his attention to historical fiction, his first love inspired by his mother's stories and his admiration for the works of Sir Walter Scott. The result was Micah Clarke, a tale based on the Monmouth Rebellion. It was a great critical and financial success, and it was in this that convinced Conan Doyle that his future lay in writing. The US-based Lippincott's magazine commissioned a second Sherlock Holmes novel in 1890, and he produced The Sign of Four in less than a month. However, it wasn't until 1891 when the Strand magazine began its series of 12 short stories, later known as The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, that the character of Holmes really struck a chord with the public. It was Conan Doyle who had approached the Strand in the first instance. It had struck me that a single character running through a series, if it only engaged the reader, would bind the reader to that magazine. And that is exactly what happened. Within 6 months of the Baker Street Detective's first appearance in the Strand, A Scandal in Bohemia, the main selling point of the magazine was each new Holmes adventure. That love of books is among the choicest gifts of the gods. Arthur Conan Doyle, Through the Magic Door, published in 1907. Marriage and a Break. Meanwhile, in 1885, Conan Doyle had married Louise Toohey Hawkins, the sister of one of his patients. It was a union that dogged by Louise's constant ill health. In 1891, the couple moved from Southsea to Tennyson Road in South Norwood into southeast London so Conan Doyle could be closer to the literary world. However, after giving birth to 2 children, Mary, born in 1889, and Kingsley, born in 1892, Louise was diagnosed with tuberculosis. Her condition declined rapidly, and she remained an invalid for the rest of her life. In 1884, they left London and moved into a new house, Undershaw in Hindhead, Surrey, since Conan Doyle believed the air would be better for Louise's health. Despite the success of the first series of Holmes' tales, Conan Doyle quickly became bored with his creation, and although he succumbed to the offer of an increased fee for his second series, he was determined that this should be the last. He wanted to spend some more time writing historical fiction, which he saw as a more worthy pursuit and one that would gain him greater recognition as a serious author. In 1893, he visited Switzerland with Louise. It was while he was there that he visited the Reichenbach Falls and decided that this would be a place that would make a worthy tomb for poor Sherlock, even if I buried my banking account along with him. So, in the last story of the second collection, The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, 1893, he consigned his hero to the watery depths of the Reichenbach Falls, locked in the arms of the criminal mastermind Professor Moriarty. Ignoring the public howls of complaint about his murder of Holmes, he concentrated on a wide range of other writing projects, including A Tale of Regency Life, Rodney Stone, 1886, and a novel about the Napoleonic Wars, Uncle Bernac, in 1897, Evan, and many short stories. As Conan Doyle's stature as a writer and his wealth both grew, he became increasingly involved in public life and the literary scene. Among his distinguished friends and acquaintances was a set of authors who, like Conan Doyle, had created remarkable characters who would resonate with the public long after their deaths. Bram Stoker, Dracula, J. M. Barrie, Peter Pan, Robert Louis Stevenson, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Oscar Wilde, Dorian Gray. In 1927, the Strand magazine ran a competition asking its readers to guess which of the Sherlock Holmes stories were Conan Doyle's favorites. Conan Doyle announced his choices in a Strand article titled How I Made My List. None of the stories from the casebook of Sherlock Holmes were eligible since it had not yet been published as a book. However, he began listing The Lion's Mane and The Illustrious Client as his favorites from that collection. The conclusive list of his favorites was as follows. First, The Speckled Band, The Red-Headed League, and The Dancing Man for their original plots, followed by The Final Problem, A Scandal in Bohemia, and The Empty House, which respectively featured the only foe who ever really extended Holmes, more female interest than his usual, and the difficult task of explaining away the alleged death of Holmes. He then selected The Five Orange Pips and The Priory School for their dramatic moments, The Second Stain for its high diplomacy and intrigue, and The Devil's Foot for being grim and new. With its description of Holmes' early life and a historical touch which gives it a little added distinction, the Musgrave Ritual was also given a place on his favorites list. And finally he added the Reigate Square, in which Holmes shows perhaps the most ingenuity. War and a Resurrection. Conan Doyle was actively engaged in the Boer War 1899-1902, offering medical assistance at the Langman Field Hospital in Bloemfontein in South Africa in appalling conditions and visiting the front. He later wrote up the history of the war in a pamphlet vindicating the actions of the British Army. It was at the turn of the century that Conan Doyle hit upon a plot for a new mystery story, The Hound of the Baskervilles. Constructing the framework of the story with the aid of his friend, journalist Fletcher Robinson, the author realized that he needed a central character to play detective, and so he resurrected Sherlock Holmes. The novel was set in 1889, 2 years before Holmes supposedly fell to his death at the Reichenbach Falls. It was first serialized in the Strand in 1901 and published in book form in 1902. In the same year, Conan Doyle was given a knighthood in recognition of his pamphlet in the Boer War and service at the front, although many felt that the honor was more of a thank you for bringing about the return of Sherlock Holmes. By 1904, the author succumbed to the offers of large fees and began writing more Holmes short stories. A New Holmes Tale? In 2015, a new Sherlock Holmes story was discovered in an attic in Selkirk, Scotland. Sherlock Holmes, Discovering the Borderbergs and by deduction the Brig Bazaar, may have been written by Conan Doyle in 1904, although this has not yet been confirmed, as part of a booklet of short stories called Book of the Brig. The booklet was printed to raise money to replace a local bridge that had been destroyed by flooding in 1902. Conan Doyle regularly visited Selkirk and may have contributed the story to assist locals in their fundraising efforts. He was involved in politics at this time, seeking election as a liberal unionist. In the story, Holmes uses his powers of observation and deduction to predict that Watson is about to travel to Selkirk to open a bazaar to raise money for a bridge. In typical Holmesian style, the detective announces that although Watson has not told him of his plans, his actions have revealed the bent of your mind. A second marriage. Conan Doyle's relationship with his wife Louise was a strong friendship rather than passionate romance, and it wasn't until he met Jean Leckie that he experienced the full emotional force of his romantic love. He first encountered this attractive Scottish woman, 14 years his junior in 1897, and fell head over heels in love with her. He confessed to his mother how he felt about Jean and told close friends too, who were divided on the subject. Conan Doyle's brother-in-law, E.W. Hornung, the writer of the Raffles detective stories, was furious at what he considered to be infidelity. However, Conan Doyle was not physically unfaithful to Louise. His strong personal code of chivalry forbade him to take his affair with Jean into the realms of sexual congress. Nevertheless, the strain must have placed Conan Doyle under the psychological rack. His fondness and sense of duty to his invalid wife kept him by her side, while at the same time his passion for Jean tormented both his heart and mind. Louise died in 1906 and Conan Doyle married Jean a year later. Shortly after the wedding, they moved to a new house, Little Windlesham in Crowborough, Sussex. It was a happy marriage, and Jean bore Conan Doyle 3 more children: Dennis, 1909, Adrian, 1910, and Lena Jean, 1912. On the side of justice, it was during this period that Conan Doyle became involved in a personal fight to establish the innocence of a Parsee, George Adelgee, convicted of horse and cattle maiming in Warwickshire. Using the methods of his detective hero, Conan Doyle was able to establish that Adelgee could not have performed the savage attacks of the animals because of his very poor eyesight. The writer Julian Barnes, fascinated by the case, recounted the story in his 2005 historical novel Arthur and George, which was later dramatized and broadcast on television in 2015. In addition, there were other causes that Conan Doyle took up where he felt that injustice had been wrought. His moral standards prompted him to investigate matters where he believed that misjudgments had been made. Notably, he campaigned to have the death penalty lifted for Roger Casement, a traitor during World War II, but he was not successful. Similarly, he protested the innocence of Oscar Slater, a German Jew accused of murder. Thanks to Conan Doyle's efforts, Slater was released in 1927 after serving 18 years of a life sentence. Spiritualism. With the outbreak of World War I in 1914, Conan Doyle became instrumental in forming the local volunteer force, a forerunner of the Home Guard, and acted as a war correspondent, visiting the battlefronts. Perhaps it was the senseless slaughter of so many young lives that revitalized his interest in spiritualism, for in 1916 he became convinced that he should devote his final years to the advancement of this belief. It was a decision that was further strengthened by the tragic death of his son, Kingsley, who passed away at the age of 26 after succumbing to pneumonia following his wounding on the Somme in 1918. In the last decade of his life, Conan Doyle gave most of his time and energy to lecturing on spiritualism in Australia, US, Canada, and South Africa. He was careful and thorough in testing mediums, but there were occasions on which he was deceived, and his critics seized upon these to illustrate what they regarded as his credulity. Certainly, when two young girls claimed to have seen and photographed fairies in a watery dell near their home in Cottingley, Yorkshire, and Conan Doyle, together with Edward Gardner, a leading theosophist, declared them to be genuine, he appeared very gullible. It was Conan Doyle's obsession with spiritualism and his search for a proof of a life beyond death that led him into a brief friendship with the magician Harry Houdini, who was also a spiritualist. The two men eventually fell out after a seance with Lady Jean Conan Doyle, Arthur's wife, acting as a medium, apparently received a written message from Houdini's dead mother. As the magician's mother was a Hungarian Jew and couldn't speak or write a word of English, Houdini denounced the seance as being false. The magician also later wrote a mocking article about the incident, sealing the rift between the two men. A man's soul and reason are his own, and he must go whither they beckon. Arthur Conan Doyle, letter to the Scotsman, October 1900. A fitting end. The spiritualist tours were arduous and physically draining, and Conan Doyle's health suffered as a result. He was now in his late 60s, but it appeared that he was making no allowances for his advancing age. In 1929, he suffered severe pains in his chest and was diagnosed with angina. The doctors advised that he cancel all his spiritualist lectures, but the author was adamant that he would not let the public down by failing to honor his engagements. On his way to the Albert Hall, he suffered a violent attack, and from then on, all physical exertion was forbidden. Some little time later, he was discovered lying in the hallway of his home, clutching a single white snowdrop in his hand. He had seen the flowers through the window and had struggled from his sick bed to take one of the blooms. By now, Conan Doyle knew he was dying. A few days before his death, he wrote, "The reader will judge that I have had many adventures. The greatest and the most glorious awaits me now." He informed his family that he did not wish to pass away in bed, so they helped him to a chair where he could look through the window at the Sussex countryside beyond, and he died there, surrounded by his family, on the morning of July 7th, 1930. His last words were to his beloved Jean, "You are wonderful." He was buried in the garden of his home at Windlesham, but his remains were later moved to the nearby churchyard in Minstead. The inscription on his gravestone is "Steel True, Blade Street." My mother's and father's devotion to each other at all times was one of the most wonderful things I have ever known. Adrian Conan Doyle, The New York Times, July 8th, 1930. A man of many parts. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a remarkable man in all areas of his life. His literary output covers perhaps a wider range than any other writer of the 19th and early 20th centuries. As well as detective stories, he wrote poetry, plays, domestic dramas, sea stories, historical romances, supernatural thrillers, medical tales, and various spiritualist tracts. However, as well as being a remarkable author, he was also a brilliant, energetic, innovative man with strong personal visions, attitudes, and ideas, a Victorian with a 20th century outlook. His passion drove him to pursue a wide range of activities. He ran for Parliament unsuccessfully. He played cricket for the MCC, once capturing the wicket of the great W.G. Grace. He promoted cross-country skiing in Switzerland. He was one of the first car owners. He had a keen interest in photography and contributed articles on the subject to the British Journal of Photography. And of course, he was also a doctor, a title that he prized above all others. With so many outstanding and fascinating qualities, it is not surprising that his most famous literary creation, Sherlock Holmes, was imbued with a similar kind of brilliance.